Mr. President,
Senator from Maryland,
I ask consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
without objection.
I yield back the time.
Without objection.
Ask for the yeas and nays.
The question is on the Caproni nomination.
Ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin.
Yeah, he came, well, it was when he was doing his conference, he had dinner with the senators of Jackson.
Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain.
No, I think it's going to be a little serious. Did you move
Mrs. McCaskill.
Yeah. Oh, Judy did. I already had dinner with some folks.
Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez.
Yeah, I can use some of the help in the members. This is helpful.
Mr. Merkley.
said anything about it yet?
Generically for
Ms. Mikulski.
but it's policy.
Mr. Moran. Ms. Markowski.
Really?
Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson.
Nice job.
Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada.
You'll stop talking. I agree the votes.
Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts.
Joe, you recovered?
The only thing we're missing is the defense. Other than that, we were ready to go.
Mr. Rockefeller.
And I don't understand it. I really don't, 'cause I don't think
Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions.
Hey, Jeff.
Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow.
But you know that going in. You scored 30, you should win that game. You scored 30, you should win that game.
Mr. Tester.
They could. Every team plays.
Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse.
Oh, you too. Oh, that's right. It's usually black. Oh,
daughter
I think
is in
it's black.
Oh, you all met with her?
No, I'm not doing it over to you.
Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Bennett, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Chiesa, Coates, Collins, Coons, Corker, Cornyn, Donnelly, Fisher, Flake, Franken, Gillibrand, Graham, Hagan, Heitkamp, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, McCain, McCaskill, McConnell, Murkowski, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Sanders, Schatz, Sessions, Shaheen, Tester, Thune, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Wicker, Wyden.
Very short with me as the senator.
Mr. Heinrich, aye. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Blunt, Bozeman, Coburn, Cochran, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Heller, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, Moran, Hall, Risch, Roberts, Rubio. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Vitter, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Scott, no. Ms. Ayotte, no. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Kirk, no. Mr. Inhofe, no. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Begich, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 73, the nays are 24. The nomination is confirmed. The question now occurs on the Broderick nomination. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motions to reconsider are considered made and laid upon the table. The President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate will resume legislative session.
Mr. President.
The Senate will come to order. The Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I ask now unanimous consent we proceed to a period of morning business. Senators allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Okay, Mr. President, for the information of all senators.
The Senate will come to order.
Mr. President, tomorrow I've spoken to the Republican leader.
Senate's not in order.
The Senate will come to order.
Mr. President, tomorrow the President is going to brief the Democratic caucus and the Republican caucus separately. He's going to address the nation tomorrow night. As we all know, there are international discussions continuing relative to the matter in Syria. Normally what I would do in a situation like this is file cloture today, but I don't think that's to our benefit. I don't think we need to see how fast we can do this. We have to see how well we can do this matter. So I'm not going to file cloture this evening on the motion to proceed to the Syria resolution. I've spoken to the Republican leader. I've talked to virtually all my Democratic senators, and we have enough votes to get cloture. But I don't think this is a counting numbers thing tonight. I think what we need to do is make sure that the President has the opportunity to speak to all 100 senators and all 300 million American people before we do this. As I've said before, when we get on this, we're going to have this in a manner that is dignified and move forward in a way that's expeditious, but yet one that's thorough. So I've discussed this with the President and the other people in the administration. I repeat, I want to make sure that the President has full opportunity to make his case to the Senate and the American people before we begin voting on this matter. As always, I'll continue to discuss this with Senator McConnell, and we'll see if we can reach some kind of agreement to move forward on this without cloture, but if that doesn't work out, I will file cloture when appropriate.
The Senator from Ohio. Senate will be in order. The Senator from Ohio.
President, I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business for up to 15 minutes, 10 minutes, and 15 minutes, and after I conclude my remarks, Senator Inhofe of Oklahoma, Senator Casey of Pennsylvania will be recognized.
Is there any objections? Without objection, the Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. President. Most of us were in our states over Labor Day. I come to the floor generally a few days after Labor Day when we return back to Washington and talk about the importance of Labor Day and what it means to working Americans, what it's meant to our country, what it's meant to building a strong middle class. I'd like to read a letter sent to me by Bill Ross, an Ohio business leader. Mr. Ross tells his story like this. He writes, "I grew up in a first-generation immigrant family in a small Ohio town. My father obtained only an 8th grade education, not uncommon for his generation. He worked hard in an industrial job. My mother worked at home to care for our family of 5 children. When able to do so, she went to work outside the household, too. We rented a home for $25 a month, ate nutritious meals at home, and all walked to school with clean clothes each day. All 5 children went to college, obtained postgraduate and professional degrees, and pursued rewarding professional careers in law, education, and business. How did this happen? Mr. Ross writes, because first and foremost, my father had a job with a living wage and health care for his family that his union protected. Because we had access to good quality public education, because we had access to affordable state universities and student loan programs that we could later afford to repay, because blue-collar working people had a chance. I hope we can restore all that in America again. Bill Ross's story is very much like my wife Connie's story. Bill Ross, born in Ashtabula, a bit before my wife, born in Ashtabula. Bill Ross's dad carried a union card. His mother went to work when she could. My wife's father carried a utility workers union card for more than 30 years in Ashtabula, Ohio. When her mother was a home care worker and worked when she could after the children were a little older. My wife, as did Bill Ross, was able to go to school with minimal debt. She graduated from Kent State University in the 1970s with not much more than $1,200 in student debt. Living wage, carried a union card, celebrating Labor Day because it gave so many working families a chance. The presiding officer comes from a state much like mine. He understands the importance of carrying a union card and getting a living wage and giving people the kind of opportunity that people in this country deserve. For generations, hardworking Americans left their homes every morning, some at night, to earn an honest living. They've bent swollen knees to put on steel-toe work boots to provide for loved ones. They put up with calloused hands to build a better life for their children. Middle-class Americans, people struggling to enter the middle class, labor to ensure that children have enough food and clean clothes and an adequate education to thrive. We know that steelworkers and nurses and mechanics and teachers and plumbers are not always treated with the dignity that they deserve, especially far too often from our elected officials. American history is a history of struggle for working people, fighting for representation and fair wages, for access to good-paying jobs, for the dignity every human being deserves. It's about fighting for democracy and civil rights, as we were reminded a few days ago when we marked the 50th anniversary of the March in Washington for Jobs and Freedom. More than a century ago, when John Patterson Green, an Ohioan, and Cedarville, Ohio native James Henderson Kyle introduced a bill to establish Labor Day as a state holiday in Ohio, they weren't thinking of any one segment of the population. They are focused on the rights of all Americans who work hard and play by the rules. Since then, we've seen how the middle class grew when we ensure that hard work is rewarded with fair pay and decent benefits. 75 years ago, President Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which ultimately ensured that American workers would receive a minimum wage, reasonable work hours, and an end to child labor. One of the authors of that bill, Senator Hugo Black, sat at this specific desk in the United States Senate, supporting Social Security, supporting minimum wage, supporting paying for overtime. It was that legislation he introduced initially in 1932. President Roosevelt led us to decades of prosperity by ensuring that hard work is met with fair wages and decent working conditions. A minimum wage helped to lift millions of Americans from poverty and allowed them to join the middle class. Today, workers face new challenges. While corporate executives and Wall Street banks are earning record profits, too many families in Ohio and Indiana and Oklahoma and across the country are still struggling. Some politicians have used the recession and the budget crisis it's created as ground for attacking workers' rights. Across the country, we've seen vicious attacks on workers' rights. We've seen it in North Carolina. We saw it last year in Indiana. We saw it last year in Michigan. We're seeing it over the last 3 years in Ohio. Ohio passed one of the worst attacks on collective bargaining rights in Ohio's history, trying to convince people that public employees caused the financial crisis. not Wall Street. Workers fought back, shattering a record for signatures needed to establish a ballot initiative and energizing 2 million voters who came out to overturn that wrong-headed law. Today, because of the unity of not just labor union members, but the huge majority of voters in Ohio. Because of that, police officers, firefighters, sanitation workers, teachers, and other public sector workers continue to have the right to bargain and work with management through collective bargaining to ensure safety and fairness on the job. In Akron, Ohio, UAW workers at Meggitt produce high-quality and efficient work, allowing them to be competitive with workers in Mexico, preventing operations from being outsourced and helping to attract new investment in Ohio. In Toledo and Youngstown and Cleveland, beyond, union auto workers help bring back the American auto industry. They're building the cars of the future that people want to drive. I've met with business owners across Ohio over this August and month before that in my 7 years in the Senate. Ohio workers who want to pay their workers a fair wage and have joined in efforts to raise the minimum wage. They know increasing the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour will increase gross domestic product by nearly $33 billion over 3 years as workers spend their raises in their local businesses and communities. This activity would generate 140,000 new jobs over the course of 3 years. The American people, it's no surprise that the American public is anxious about our place in an increasingly multipolar, complicated, dynamic global economy. People know that NAFTA and CAFTA and permanent China trade relations when they were passed, plants closed, we lost 5 million good-paying manufacturing jobs. Never in history has company after company after company implemented a business plan where you close down production in Steubenville or Toledo or Dayton, Ohio, move overseas to Wuhan, Xi'an, or Shanghai, China, and sell the products back to the United States. That business plan led us to this. In 1977, manufacturing was 20% of our GDP. Financial services represented significantly less. That flipped by 2010, where manufacturing is now only about 11% of GDP. Between 2000 and 2010, because of wrong-headed trade agreements, because of tax policy that has given incentives to move offshore, our country lost 5 million manufacturing jobs, 60,000 plants closed down. Since 2010, we've seen manufacturing jobs grow by more than 500,000. That's not good enough. We've got to enact an agenda that includes the best trained workers, the most developed and sophisticated infrastructure, the most robust manufacturing base, the strongest defense against currency manipulation. Until every American worker is able to rise out of poverty, we still have work to do. Labor Day, celebrated last week, shouldn't simply mark the end of summer. It should mark the beginning of a renewed commitment to fighting for American workers, to fighting for American business, and to strengthen our middle class. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
First of all, let me thank my friend, the distinguished senator, for including me in his unanimous consent request. I am just briefly going to talk about an amendment. We all understand that the issue is going to come before this body to send activity into Syria, and I'm very much opposed to any kind of force in Syria. But if it happens, we want to be sure that there's some protection in there. So I have an amendment that even if my amendment passes, I will still oppose the effort of this president to send activity into Syria, and I believe which would precipitate a war. So my amendment's very simple. If the president takes military action against Syria, sequestration of our armed forces would be delayed for 1 year. Now, we're talking about the fiscal year where it would take another $52 billion out of our military. What Assad has done and continues to do is reprehensible, but the United States can't afford another war given the current state of our military. The threats from Syria and the Middle East are not emerging threats. These threats have been around for decades. We knew that they were there. There's nothing new about them. Yet the readiness and capabilities of our military continue to be decimated by drastic budget cuts. The 16 Air Force combat flying squadrons have been grounded. We finally, after 3 months, put them back in the air again, and right now we know it costs more to get them back in a state of readiness than the money that was saved by grounding them for 3 months. Our naval fleet has been reduced to historically low levels, and the end strength of our ground forces have been cut by more than 100,000 personnel, and hundreds of thousands of DoD civilian employees have been furloughed. You know, just in my state of Oklahoma, in one of my installations, 14,000 civilian employees have been furloughed. Well, we can't have it both ways. Continue to cut the funding of our military while still expecting it to meet our national security requirements as military readiness and capabilities decline. We accept greater risk. And as I've always said, risk equals lives. Every time we have a hearing, we have our combatant commanders come in and talk about the risk. Risk means lives. As I've always said, risk equals lives, and allowing these cuts to continue while proposing to send our forces into harm's way is immoral and reprehensible. Over the last week, I've heard from a lot of the President and his administration about how any action in Syria will be limited, and I suggest no such thing as limited war. Once we decide to strike, we can't predict where we'll end up or how the situation might escalate. Let's not forget that we have troops currently on the ground in Jordan and in Turkey, Marines guarding our embassies, sailors and airmen stationed around the region. We've already heard that Iran is ordering its terrorist proxies to retaliate against by attacking the United States' interests in the region, including our embassy in Iraq. The State Department has ordered non-essential personnel to evacuate our embassy in Lebanon, and the threats of our forces are real. You know, I'd like to read for my colleagues excerpts from a letter that was written by two ladies, Rebecca Sanderlin and Molly Blake. Now, these are spouses of two of our servicemen. They're responding much more eloquently than I could ever hope to the immense hardships of our military is enduring under the sequestration, to the misguided belief that a military strike on Syria can be done in isolation, that it won't affect our troops and their families. Now, I'm going to ask that the entire letter be made a part of the record at this time.
Without objection.
And I'd like to quote, and I ask my colleagues to listen to the quote. These are the two ladies who are spouses of servicemen. They said, quote, "There's no such thing as a person-less war. Our military cannot afford for Americans to forget that wars and battles and military strikes are fought by troops, that troops are people, and that those people have families. In our military communities this summer, we couldn't even afford to pay federal employees for a 5-day work week. Military families can't get doctor's appointments and can't get counseling services needed to grapple with the problems that we already have, problems largely created by almost 12 years of war. Today, clinic hours are being slashed, along with pretty much every other service military family needs. Walking around our communities lately, it doesn't look like we can afford much of anything, and certainly not a whole new war." I'm still quoting now these wives of our military men. "And maybe someday we will be able to fight whole wars without using a single human, but today, in 2013, we can't have a surgical strike without someone saying where to drop the bombs or where to aim those missiles. And those planes that drop the bombs, the destroyers that carry the missiles, they have pilots, they have captains and crews. All humans, even the unmanned drones, have human pilots, and the psychological wear and tear on them is staggering. Planes take off from airfields in foreign lands and from aircraft carriers, both of which are staffed by thousands of American somebodies, just like those destroyer ships. At every turn in the military operation, you will find people, intel analysts, linguists, flight crews, and cooks. Even war plans rely on thousands of people who will be pulled to a new duty, which causes reshuffling far and wide in the military community, and this most definitely affects our military families." Again, that's a quote from two of the wives of our servicemen. I hope all my colleagues will read this letter. I hope they'll understand that the decisions we make this week about whether or not to go to war in Syria have a human dimension. If we expect the brave men and women in our military to go to foreign lands and risk their lives on our behalf, we have a moral obligation to ensure that they and their families have the support and the resources that are required. Sequestration has already inflicted more severe damage on our military, and we've now only a couple of weeks before another $52 billion is being slashed from an already devastated military budget. I've been clear, and that I don't support the President's call for military action in Syria. He still hasn't presented Congress and the American people with a plan for what he wants to accomplish, how he intends to accomplish it, or how he intends to pay for it. Will the President pay for this operation with more furloughs and by grounding more squadrons again? The CNO has already come forward and stated that if operations against Syria extend into October, he won't be able to afford it and will likely require supplemental funding from Congress. Furthermore, the President hasn't told us how a strike in Syria fits into a broader strategy for the Middle East. What we've decided to do is not just about Syria. It's bigger than that. This is about the growing threat from Iran, stability in the Middle East, and our commitment to Israel and allies, and our ability to respond to other contingencies that are there. You know, I recall knowing what was going to happen. This is 4.5 years ago. This is back when President Obama was first elected, his first election. And I knew that when he came out with his first budget, that he was going to do something devastating to the military. And so I put myself into Afghanistan, knowing with the tanks going back and forth that I'd be able to get the interest and the attention of the American people, and it worked. And so that very first budget, 4.5 years ago, he did away with our only fifth-generation bomber, the F-22, did away with our future combat system, the first ground capability increase in about 50 years, did away with our lift capacity, the C-17. And then the worst thing, which I hope doesn't turn out to be the worst thing, create the worst problem for America, did away with the ground-based operation in Poland. Now, that was just the first budget. That was 4.5 years ago. And since that time, he's, in his extended budget, taken $487 billion out of the military. And with sequestration, it would be another $500 billion. And this just can't happen. You know, it's not just me that's saying this. People would expect it more from me. I am the ranking member on the Senate Armed Services Committee. I go over there and I work with these guys, and I know just the problems that they have. I would suggest that not just me, but Admiral Winnefeld, who is the second highest military guy and the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, could be for the, he said, there could be for the first time in my career, this is an Admiral speaking now, the second highest person in our military, instances where we may be asked to respond to a crisis and we will have to say we cannot. And then to go to the very top person, General Dempsey. General Dempsey, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, quote, our military force is so degraded, so unready, it would be immoral to use force. I would only say this because we're going to be faced with this case, and I would say that I would be opposed to this even if my amendment to postpone the sequestration on the military for 1 year. However, even if that passes, I would still oppose this from taking place. I don't think many people in America realize what has happened under the Obama administration to our military. Well, I've just stated what has happened. This is certainly not a time when we would increase and use force in Syria. Keep in mind, when General Dempsey said it would be immoral to use force, we are so degraded, and that's exactly what we'll be voting on in the next couple of days. With that, I yield the floor and suggest an absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.